It's wonderful to be a host today because nobody here needs an introduction. So my job is done for me. And I want to thank you, Larry, for the effort you've made to help this event come true today, and to help. Thank you for your guidance and your support as we put it together. Larry, please.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific and powerful video. Congratulations to the people who made it. I confess, though, that I had the thought as it was running that if Jim had been in charge of there being a tribute video for somebody else, the video would have been produced and directed by Steven Spielberg, because Jim would have had a way of making a connection with Steven Spielberg. And in that is a powerful story of what a determined man who always wants the best can accomplish. I want to talk a little bit about Jim and the World Bank, and then I want to talk a bit about what I learned in my years of watching Jim in action. It's really true that when Jim became president of the World Bank, the people in the world who cared most about eliminating poverty were the people in the world who hated the World Bank the most and wanted to see the World Bank put out of existence. Jim changed that. He changed that with a combination of his willingness to listen and dialogue with those people, and he changed it with the programs he put in place at the World Bank that caused it to have a very different orientation than it had before. The World Bank has had two presidents in its history who served at length with rigor and a commitment to excellence, and at the same time, a deep and profound commitment to its moral mission. Bob McNamara and Jim Wolfensohn. And without them, we would not have anything like today's World Bank. I remember when Jim started the focus on HIPC. At the time, it was sort of a thing. There were 50 states in the United States. We believed in the United States. Global cooperation was good. And international financial institutions never repaid their debt, never forgave any debt. And those propositions were of about equal weight in how the world saw things. Jim had the boldness and imagination to realize that it didn't make any sense, really, for it to be that way. And he asked why it had to be that way. And he used his substantial financial acumen to drive the creation of all the right spreadsheets. He used his moral energy to talk about what it meant for children around the world. And he used his being Jim to cause Bono to devote 6 months of his life to this cause. And we had debt reduction for countries, and a lot of children who wouldn't otherwise have been alive are alive today. And by the way, these issues are circling back again and will need to be very much on the agenda, I believe, over the next several years, albeit in a somewhat different form than they were in 1999. there were a zillion economists who had estimated capital gaps of one kind or other. There were an abundance of models of internal rate of return and cost-benefit analysis. The bank was full of them. And when Jim arrived at the bank, there was not a single systematic effort to reduce corruption, even though the evidence of the eyes was that in terms of what separated the bank's hopes from the bank's achievements, corruption was of immense importance. Jim put corruption at the center of the bank's concern. Now, Jim would be the first to recognize that we still have corruption in the world, and it still is a substantial problem. But I believe that because of Jim's efforts, we have more integrity, fewer bribes, and a substantially better functioning global economy than we would otherwise have. Jim did another thing. Jim put the bank and its concerns in the first rank of the global agenda. Somehow, every time there was a G7, we were discussing poverty in Africa. It hadn't always been that way. Some of it was a tribute to the power and moral force of Jim's rhetoric. Some of it was a tribute to the quality of Jim's network. Some of it was that it was just easier for whoever was hosting the G7 to agree to have an hour of discussion of whatever subject Jim wanted to discuss than it was to have 10 more phone calls with Jim. But however he did it, the bank's concerns became the world's concerns, and that legacy has continued as well. Jim saved the bank, Jim brought the bank into a new era, and Jim propelled the bank forward. I was privileged as a Treasury official through the first 60% of Jim's time at the bank to have a ringside seat as he pursued these agendas. There was an occasional moment when I kind of wondered whether Jim and I were in the ring together, and not necessarily in precisely the same corner. But I learned an enormous amount watching him in action. And I just want to conclude by sharing the three most important lessons that I think I learned watching him. It matters much more what you're for than what you're against. Jim didn't try to stop things. Jim tried to start things. You saw it there. Does it really make sense to have like the world's teenagers be united discussing development? I don't know exactly, but some good might come of it. Is religion the work of an economic development organization? I'm not completely sure whether it is or it isn't, but again, good might well come of it. Jim understood what people in finance call real options, that if you plant a lot of seeds, you'll get more trees than if you plant very few seeds. And Jim was planting a seed every week. And if somebody thought this is beyond our capacity to do, Jim would say, well, work harder, let's hire more people, let's do more stuff. We don't have the bandwidth was not a concept that Jim was prepared to hear. And as a consequence, people think more broadly and more ambitiously and in a much more multifaceted way about development than they did before Jim arrived. Second thing I learned watching Jim was how important it was to be optimistic. Jim didn't think there was any dishonor in falling short of an extremely worthy goal, but making progress nonetheless. Jim knew that nobody was ever going to achieve more than they set out to achieve. So whether it was worldwide goals for girls' education, or whether it was what happiness was going to be in the bank's personnel survey, Jim was always optimistic, and Jim always set an ambitious goal, and remarkably often, those goals were achieved. He was a visionary and an optimist. And probably the most important thing that I learned, because I hadn't really seen anything like it before I became engaged with Jim, was the enormous power of human connection and what can be achieved when you're determined to achieve human connection. And there is no one I have ever known with the capacity to achieve human connection when it mattered than, in a way, like Jim. I kind of saw it with my own eyes in about week 2 of when Jim was president of the World Bank. Jim was president of the World Bank. I was the official at Treasury who kind of was responsible for the relationship with the World Bank. We didn't know each other very well. Jim figured out that I loved to play tennis. Jim probably hadn't played tennis in 5 years. He went off and got himself a tennis racket, and Jim and I played tennis. And Jim and I were friends. It wouldn't occur to anybody else who was the president of the World Bank that they ought to figure out what sport. And, if I'd liked to play curling, Jim would have gone curling. Maybe he wouldn't have for me, but for somebody, he would have. And then I kind of watched over the next few years. And, there are lots of Russian heads of state, and there have been lots of Russian heads of state and Russian prime ministers and stuff, and there have been lots of heads of international finance officials. The only one who ever spent 3 days in the hunting lodge of the Russian head of state was Jim Wolfensohn. And for a while, I thought it was just these sequences. It was just like a coincidence. It was interesting. Jim kind of knew this guy. And then I kind of realized that every major head of state, Jim somehow became their best personal friend within 18 months. He would go off and, they'd be having like their family and Jim. They'd be having like their special government retreat and Jim. And it was a stunning skill. I did begin to understand why he had been so successful in the mergers and acquisitions investment advisory business, because I had a feeling he may have applied this skill before he became president of the World Bank. But that capacity to achieve a relationship of trust with people who were important to one's mission, Jim had more than anyone I have seen before or since. And it propelled him throughout his career. And in his decade at the bank, it propelled the bank to a level on the international stage that was like no other. There's no one else I've ever seen who could become Moman Singh's great confidant and discussion partner, and then the next day could, go teach a class in folk dancing to a bunch of Indian third graders in a highly credible way. It was a staggering human achievement, and it made an immense difference for the World Bank and the world development effort. And as anyone who knows me knows, I have may have observed this, but I certainly have not successfully emulated Jim's skills. But I have learned from watching his example, and for that, I will always be grateful, as we are all grateful for the remarkable contribution that Jim has made to the global development effort and more broadly to the human spirit. Thank you, Jim Wolfensohn.